I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of Movie Star Magic. And this week we're going to be looking at one of the most fascinating careers, from shy, awkward 70s star to a big, bulging, bombastic action movie star of the 80s. I'm talking about the fascinating career of Sylvester Stallone. But if you're new to the series, what I do every single week is talk about actors, break down their career arcs, and then try to understand their defining feature. What is it that they bring to movies that the director doesn't, the writer does? What do they bring that makes it a Sylvester Stallone movie? Now more than ever, in a seeming era of lack of movie stars, or at least less importance compared to the 40s or the 90s or throughout Hollywood history, while movie stars are still important, they're less so important. They can't necessarily open a movie. So I want to be interested to see, look back on some of these movies and say, hey, what was the reasons why some of these people like Sylvester Stallone could open a movie and could be a movie star, and what was his sort of brand? So essentially the show every single week is structured as such. I break down the actor's career in 3 different chapters, giving a defining role to each chapter to help you understand what the sort of chapter and sort of period I'm looking at, and sort of understand their career arc, how they're able to evolve or not evolve or change into their later years. And then in the second part of the video, I talk about their defining feature. What is that one thing that they've had pretty much since the beginning that they've been able to utilize, that one special thing that no one else has that makes them such a compelling movie star? So into the career arc section of this video, chapter 1, I'm going to title this chapter of his career The Thoughtful Man. Of course, everyone knows the story of Rocky, sort of an insanely insane story, a Hollywood story of a guy, an unknown guy who'd been in very few movies, writing his own movie, getting it sort of eventually made, but taking less money to star in it, and then it becoming the biggest movie of the year and winning Best Picture. I mean, it's the literal dream scenario. But he really didn't keep up this persona later on into the second and third chapters, where he became a little bit more of an action star. This, especially if you look at the Rocky movies, Rocky in the first movie is almost very different than Rocky in the fourth movie, for example. But in this period, he plays a lot of sort of Rocky-esque actors, I'd say probably from 76 to 85. We forget about movies like the First Blood, the first Rambo movie, because we think, oh, Rambo, right, that's the guy who just shoots everyone up. But in First Blood, he only kills one person. It's very much a story about a reserved man suffering from PTSD while also sort of grieving the loss of his friend. So there's a lot of that, even though Rocky 4 is this bombastic movie and Rambo 2 is sort of bombastic as well, the earlier versions of that, and really for the first decade of his career, he was sort of riding off that wave of that first Rocky, which is often playing characters, like in Paradise Alley and Nighthawks and Victory. These are a little bit more grimy guys, a little bit more street level guys, 70s, and more in line with the sort of 70s American cinema kind of a vibe. Often he'll play like shy characters or a little bit more silent types. While he is tough, he is still a little bit more shy, a little bit more reserved, and I think a little bit more focused on the human element of the character. But if we're talking about this period, the defining role of this period, of course, is Rocky. So we're skating around the fact that this period is defined by his Rocky performance. And I think Stallone is a little bit underrated as an actor, particularly when you look at some of these past movies, and every once in a while when he gives us a really terrific performance, because early on with this movie, he really showed us his sort of range. He showed us that he can be a sort of physically dominant presence, but I also think from just a pure acting perspective, he showed us that he can be, aware of that physical presence and then sort of tone it down. And he shows that he could do romance, because at the end of the day, Rocky only has really one extended long boxing sequence. And in one way, yes, it's a boxing movie, but it's also a lot more than that. It's very much a romance movie with him and Adrian. And we see that sort of romantic comedy-esque back and forth between them that shows that, hey, I'm Sylvester Stallone. I can do romance too. I can do the boxing scenes. I can be physical in that sense, but I can also be romantic, and he does a terrific job in this movie at using his size and not overpowering Adrian, but sort of feeling a little bit more welcoming, feeling a little more gentle. He also sort of an antsy energy, which sort of plays against Talia Shire's, of course, extreme shyness, but it sort of explores an interesting dynamic where I think Rocky is also sort of like introverted kind of a person, but when he sort of becomes around a really introverted, shy person, he starts to let his personality comes out, and then that allows her to bring her personality out. So really, Rocky, I think, shows his ability to show the Hollywood and everyone that he can show heart, that he has romance, but he can also do some of the more physical scenes. And Rocky is just really a perfect, ideal role for a lot of people. And hey, he wrote for himself and did it himself. And then in chapter 2, I'm calling this the bulging action star. This is the sort of 80s, mid-80s onwards. This is, in 85 is really, I think, the cutoff point where you look at in 85 he has Rocky 4, which is very very different from the very first Rocky, and very heavy on montages and the appreciation of the male physical form. And then you have First Blood Part 2, which is really sort of the first Rambo movie, and I say that in the sense that it's the first movie where he kills a bunch of people and he's saying all these sort of one-liners and whatnot. And he sort of competes with Schwarzenegger in the sort of mid-80s to mid-90s, I'd say, of these extremely physically imposing, insane kind of one-liner type movies where it's him versus the world. I remember, so you have movies like Cobra and Dread and Over the Top and even Demolition Man to a certain extent, although I'm a little bit more partial to that. But all those movies, I think, sort of have in common the fact that he really leans into the action movie, that he'll try a movie like Don't Stop or My Mom Will Shoot or Oscar, the sort of comedies, but unlike, someone like Arnold Schwarzenegger, which is probably the most similar comparison to him, particularly in this period. Unlike him, he wasn't really able to translate with comedies, so for the most part, he's action. And it's really fascinating just to see in this period that even though I don't really love a lot of these movies, Cobra, Dread, things like that, he is defining this era of action movie star. When we think of the 80s action, cocaine-filled, ultra machismo movie stars, that's him. He's playing these one-line quipping machismo, ultra male bravado kind of characters. I think of Sylvester Stallone. Now, I don't really love all these movies because I think a lot of them have sort of aged poorly in the sense that they've gone from these more serious action movies to becoming flat-out comedies and almost parodies of themselves, particularly a role like Cobra, which I think is the defining role of this period. Now let me make it clear that defining doesn't necessarily mean best or my favorite, because I'm not a huge fan of Cobra, but you have to sort of recognize it just because it is Stallone at the peak of his powers, in the sense that he wrote this movie, he produced it, it was Rambo, Rocky, and then Cobra. He wanted this to be his sort of third big one, and frankly, based on the success of the movie, it indicates that audiences weren't just showing up for Rocky, audiences weren't just showing up for Rambo, they were showing up for Sylvester Stallone, and allowed him to have this sort of late 80s career that sort of gave him that sort of blank check. This movie, Cobra, playing John Cobra Cobretti, the matchstick chewing, scissors pizza slice, cult hunting above the law kind of a cop. It is sort of the classic period movie of this period, and it has become a cult classic, but it's also one of those movies where it was probably pretty serious when it came out, and now it's just a total sort of parody of whether it be the sort of really cheesy one-liners or just the odd decisions, or the just massive amount of body count for a cop that's sort of above the law in the scenario, or just facts like there are lines in the movie that just say bring in the Cobra, like that you'd see in a Simpsons sketch 10 years later. But if you do like these sort of movies, I like a Demolition Man, there are sort of these types of flavors that I enjoy from Stallone. Cliffhanger is sort of adjacent in a certain respect, but I think that one's a little bit more polished. I think that of this sort of period, that was his defining role. He helped define the action movie, an entire genre for pretty much an entire decade, based on his physical presence, based on his ability to sort of write these characters and really lean into this genre. And he was the pro at it. So chapter 2, I think, was maybe one of his most defining periods for sure. And then in the third chapter, I'm going to title this Remember This as the name of the chapter, because I'd love to say that Stallone returned to the sort of aging veteran chapter where he goes to play a little bit more of the shy, reserved characters of the 70s as he aged gracefully. But unfortunately, I think if you look at this past sort of 21st century of Stallone, you look at the type of movies that he's made, and they're all Remember This type movies. He's made 3 Rocky movies. He's made 2 Rambo movies, and he's made going to make now 4 Expendable movies. He's going to make 3 Escape Plan movies, and Escape Plan is the only new franchise. You have to remember Rocky, you have to remember Rambo, his sort of glory days, and the Expendables is just the existence of a movie that is the most remember this movie. And ultimately, I think that's the defining role of this period, the Expendables, because of course he's still making a 4th one. Those are huge movies in terms of box office wise, but they're also sort of just the clearest examples of the lack of box office power these once big action stars had, and they're banking on the fact that, hey, you remember us in better movies, hey, we're all on the same team now, Schwarzenegger, Stallone, Willis, we're all on the same team, and we're going to make a boring, brutish action movie that's nowhere near as good as our past movies, but hey, all of us are in it, so it's kind of fun, right? That's the sort of pure existence of the sort of, we'll call it the Remember This genre, or this chapter era of Remember This. And once in a while he'll show us that he has this great performance in him, whether it be Copland or Oscar-nominated performance in Creed. He is a good actor. It's just so frustrating to see him in these sort of periods consistently rely on the sort of IP of his past, or to try to reinvigorate certain things, or to create an Escape Plan, which is a fine VOD sort of Netflix action movie, but then to continually milk that for more and more movies, it just seemed like unnecessary at certain points, because so many of the great actors that we've studied so far, in my opinion, in this sort of later period, try to transfer and be more in supporting roles and allow themselves to age. Like Creed is a classic example of that. He's so good in that he takes the sort of step back. He's the Mickey role. He's not Rocky anymore. He's not the fighter. He's doing his own sort of fighting, which is fine, and he's still supporting character in that movie, but he allows himself to age and be, deteriorate a bit. And he's so great in it. So it's so frustrating sometimes to see him do, another Expendables or another Escape Plan, because he's got some great movies still left in him. But that's what he sort of is defined in, particularly within the 80s. And I think for a lot of people, if you think of Stallone, you think of those bombastic action movies more so than you think of Paradise Alley or Victory, which is kind of unfortunate, but I think is the reality of the situation. Now jumping into the second part of this video, the defining feature, and for a lot of people, it's sometimes difficult to create one defining feature, or to say this is what is that makes them so terrific. Oftentimes, I'm watching 7, 8 movies in preparation for these videos, and oftentimes by the 6th and 7th video, I go, okay, I see the sort of through line of all these characters. I see whoever Stallone in this case is bringing to this movie. However, for Stallone, pretty much after the first time I've ever seen Sylvester Stallone, or the first rewatch of this series, it was obvious to me that this is the sensitive meathead. That this guy is great at using his physical strength, but also sort of his more emotional innocence, and using it in contrast to make a really compelling movie star and a really compelling character. And similarly to Kurt Russell, who can be charismatic and can be a jerk, but he's still got a heart of gold, that sort of back and forth, which makes very interesting characters. Stallone does something similar. On one hand, he plays the sort of physical dominance of his characters up, because that's what he has. He's an incredible physical specimen, especially throughout the 80s. Rocky IV is a masterclass in that, of just guys looking totally ripped, and for that pleasure factor, he's got that. And he really has used his physical sort of dominance in many instances. In the case of the 80s movies, where you look at a guy like Cobra and John Cobretti in the movie, and you go, yeah, that seems like a guy who could kill a lot of people just because he looks so physically imposing. So he's got that, and he's always had that, even in Rocky. Now, he either uses his body for extreme dominance, or actually to sort of contrast some of the sort of shyness or the innocence that he brings. So on one hand, he's the sensitive meathead, so he's got this sort of big physical imposing strength that he will use and utilize as well. But on the other side is that sort of sensitive side, the fact that he can rip you in half, but he doesn't. In Expendables, he's the cool leader. He's not the sort of ultra roided out rage machine. He is the sort of calm, cool leader. In Copland, he's a traumatized kind of a man. Despite his physical appearance, despite the fact that he can perform this, he's sort of been pushed to the side because his sort of innocence, because his sort of doubt has sort of crept up. So we always see that in his characters, even in something like Over the Top, which is a classic bombastic, bulging Chapter 2 kind of movie. That being said, he still has, an innocent relationship with his son, and there's a strong connection there, and he brings that out, and I think Over the Top is better for that, despite some of its, we'll say, plot inconveniences. So I think it actually adds another layer to his character, and why he's always been so, I think, compelling is because we still see that sort of innocence, we still see the sort of Rocky in him, the heart, the sort of underdog type character, despite his sort of physical appearance, and that sort of contrast of being sort of the gentle giant in all these roles, or being able to sort of tone it down and have this conversation with a kid, and then an innocent conversation, and then the next scene have this intense machismo arm wrestling scene. He's able to sort of switch back between those two modes, and I think he's a terrific actor because he's able to do that. Sometimes I wish he a little bit leans more into the dramatic, emotional, empathetic, innocent kind of a side versus so much of the leaning into the big action star. But the truth of the matter, his most defining roles do both, and that's what's such fascinating about him as a movie star persona. But that's about it, guys. I hope you're enjoying the video. Make sure you let me know your favorite Sylvester Stallone movies in the comments down below. And until next time, stay tuned.